You're standing in Jerusalem on July 15, 1099. The city's walls have collapsed. The cries of battle have faded into an eerie silence. The smoke of burning homes still lingers in the air, drifting over streets stained with the memory of war. For the warriors who fought to defend the city, their ordeal was over. For many, death came swiftly, their blood mixing with the dust of the holy city. But for the families left behind, especially the wives, daughters, and mothers of the fallen, the true nightmare was only beginning. The chronicles written by the victors would later sing of glory, of Christian knights reclaiming the city of Jerusalem, of the triumph of faith and arms, of banners lifted high above the holy places. Yet hidden between those lines lies another story, one rarely told, one erased deliberately. For every warrior who perished with sword in hand, there were women and children who lived on, only to discover that survival could be the cruelest fate of all. To modern minds, it may seem shocking, but in the medieval world, conquest was governed by rules that codified what victors could claim as theirs. When a city fell, the walls, the treasures, the livestock, and even the human beings inside were considered property. This was not seen as an aberration, it was the established order of things. Both Christian and Islamic societies of the time had legal frameworks that addressed the fate of captives, and central to these rules was the idea that women and children could be taken, processed, and distributed as spoils of war. Archaeology and records leave no doubt about how systematic this practice was. In medieval trade centers, excavations have uncovered shackles specifically sized for women's wrists, restraints built for children's ankles, and storage spaces designed to hold human beings until they could be sold. These were not random atrocities carried out by undisciplined soldiers. They were part of an organized system that functioned with chilling efficiency. Contemporary accounts and commercial documents describe the process in cold, transactional terms. Captives were classified, valued, and priced like any other commodity. Young women fetched the highest prices, considered ideal for servitude or concubinage. Mothers were valued less, though still usable as domestic laborers. Those who resisted capture were devalued, sometimes discarded entirely. To be sold was, paradoxically, a grim kind of fortune. Sale into servitude at least meant survival. For those who could not be sold, whether because of age, injury, or defiance, the outcomes were even worse. Chronicles from both the Islamic and Christian world describe these fates, though often in euphemisms that conceal the true scale of cruelty. What emerges is the picture of a system that stripped captives not only of their freedom, but of their very identity. Names were changed, faiths were forcibly abandoned, and individuals were reshaped into assets, property that could be rented, gifted, or resold. The events of July 1099 give us a striking glimpse into the sheer scale of this system. When Crusaders breached Jerusalem's defenses, they unleashed devastation upon the defenders, but they were selective. Sources suggest that around 15,000 people were taken alive. Of these, perhaps 7,000 were men, destined for execution, forced labor, or galley slavery. The remaining 8,000 were women and children, swept into a system of exploitation that would shape the rest of their lives. The city's fall was not the end of their ordeal, it was only the beginning. Families were torn apart deliberately, with mothers separated from their children to prevent resistance. Captives were marched in groups, guarded by soldiers trained to control them like herds of livestock. From Jerusalem, the streams of human cargo spread outward across the Mediterranean world. Some were kept locally, others sent by caravan along the great trade routes to Damascus, Cairo, or Baghdad. Many more were transported by sea, carried in ships designed or modified for carrying human beings. The logistics of this trade reveal how sophisticated and entrenched it had become by the 11th century. Slave caravans traveled on regular schedules, linking capture points with major markets. Rest stops were planned, food and water calculated not out of compassion but to maintain the value of the human cargo. Guards knew how to manage groups of captives, using techniques developed over generations. Maritime routes tell an equally grim story: ships built with ventilation systems, storage for water, and restraints designed to prevent suicide attempts during the voyage. These were not temporary measures of desperation. They were refinements of an industry that had been perfected over centuries. When captives arrived at markets, they were processed through what can only be described as dehumanizing rituals. Hair was cut or restyled to mark slave status. Clothing was stripped away and replaced with garments that signified ownership. Most devastatingly, names were erased. A woman named Miriam might be renamed Fatima, a woman named Aisha might become Maria. This was not merely practical. It was psychological warfare, erasing every trace of their past lives to break resistance and enforce submission. The motivations behind this system were not just military or cultural, they were economic. Municipal records from medieval cities reveal that taxes on slave sales, import duties on human cargo, and licensing fees for dealers contributed significantly to urban revenues. In other words, entire economies depended upon this trade. For captors, a captured woman was not only a servant, she was a long-term investment. Initial sales brought in silver, but the revenue did not end there. Captives could be rented, gifted to secure alliances, or resold. Some were forced into breeding arrangements, where children born of these unions became property as well. Sons might, in some cases, gain military positions, but daughters were automatically enslaved, continuing the cycle. Archaeological evidence shows disturbingly high infant mortality rates in slave compounds, suggesting that unwanted children, particularly those of mixed parentage, were deliberately killed to maintain the system's order. What made this machine even more terrifying was the way it was justified. Religious texts and legal codes were interpreted in ways that allowed the enslavement of captives as spoils of war. Theologians on both sides provided elaborate justifications, presenting the practice as divinely sanctioned. Churches and mosques did not merely tolerate the system, they participated in it. This gave the trade not only economic strength, but moral authority, making resistance nearly impossible. The law itself became a weapon. Detailed codes outlined how captives could be owned, transferred, and punished. Contracts specified age, health, origin, and guarantees about obedience. Some even included return policies, treating human beings as if they were defective merchandise. The system was sophisticated, deliberate, and devastating. Yet, even within this machinery of oppression, there are hints of resistance. Some chronicles mention women who chose death over servitude, engaging in coordinated acts of defiance that official sources often disguised as disease or accidents. Others suggest small rebellions, attempts at escape, or secret networks of solidarity. But these acts were deliberately erased from the record, their memory buried because they disrupted the narrative of control. What remains instead is silence, an intentional forgetting. The glory of conquest was recorded in great detail, while the suffering of captives was left unspoken. Yet the physical evidence still speaks: shackles rusting in the earth, foundations of holding pens, contracts carved into stone. These fragments remind us that behind the grand stories of knights and kings lay countless, untold human tragedies. When we think of the Crusades, we imagine knights in shining armor, banners fluttering, epic battles fought for faith and land. But the real cost was measured not only in fallen soldiers or captured cities. It was measured in the systematic destruction of ordinary people whose only crime was survival. Women who lost their names, their families, their identities. Children born into chains. Generations erased so that empires could grow richer, churches more powerful, and rulers more secure. For over 1,000 years, these voices have been silenced, their suffering buried beneath the triumphal songs of victory. But the evidence, bones, shackles, contracts, receipts, remains, whispering truths that chronicles refuse to preserve. So the next time you see a painting of noble knights, or read about the glorious victories of the Crusades, remember what those accounts leave out. Remember the women marched in chains through desert caravans. Remember the children separated from mothers on auction blocks. Remember that the machinery of conquest was not just about capturing cities. It was about processing human lives into assets that fueled entire civilizations. This is the history they did not want you to know, and by uncovering it, we restore at least a fragment of the dignity stolen from those countless forgotten souls.